Hello, and welcome to this episode of xConnect Northwest. I'm your host, Greg Mills, and on today's show, we're sitting down with architect and butterfly surveyor Jim Dillman to discuss the environmental impacts on butterflies in our region. Now, before we get started, a reminder to you at home, you can join us in this conversation at any time. It's real simple. Just connect with us on Twitter at NWPTV. You can use the hashtag xConnectNW as well. On Facebook, search for Northwest Public Television or by email at kwsutv@wsu.edu. Jim, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Good afternoon, Greg.
It's certainly great to have you here, and give us a brief history, if you can, about the butterflies in our mid-Columbia area.
Okay, first off, let me say what I term as mid-Columbia is basically eastern Washington and eastern Oregon. Sure, there's a little bit of Idaho and maybe northern California involved, but basically it's eastern Washington and eastern Oregon. In the beginning, butterflies probably developed with flowering plants about 144 to 66 million years ago. Butterflies could not begin in our particular portion of the mid-Columbia until about 66 to 30 million years ago, because at that time, this mid-Columbia was a great ocean bay, part of the Pacific Ocean. With the rise of the Cascade Mountains cutting off that bay and the massive basalt eruptions of Grand Ronde volcano, that bay was filled in, to a depth of about 8,000 feet of basalt. And of course, once it had filled in with that, dust blew on top of it, and the plants arrived, and with them, probably the butterflies. Now, those butterflies were probably in the surrounding area, like we know that John Day fossil beds were long before that, so the butterflies could have come in from that area. So that's basically a history of, ancient history of our region.
And you were careful to outline what the mid-Columbia region means to you and what you're referring to. Does it change quite a bit, without getting into what the differences might be necessarily, when you get outside of that and into a different region adjacent to ours as to what butterflies we'd see?
Well, of course, when I talk about the mid-Columbia, I'm talking about from the crest of the Cascades to the crest or to the face of the Rocky Mountains. And then north, I go into British Columbia a little bit, but south to the California border. So that's basically the region I'm talking about.
Now, let's talk about just what different kinds of butterflies that are in our region, and maybe how many different types we could expect to see if we knew what we were looking for.
Yeah, well, there's about 150 different types of butterflies in our region. And most of them were and still are in the mountains and forests. We see them here and there in our yards and our parks and so forth. But we only see them in their adult stage. Now, the adult stage is their life cycle, okay, where for about 2 weeks in that life cycle, they're butterflies that you see fluttering around. So that's when we see them. And they aren't there always every single month. There are different butterfly species have this 2 weeks, and a different have that 2 weeks, and a different have that 2 weeks. So there's a variety of butterflies going on from the spring, from about March all the way through October. So that's basically what we have, like 150 different kinds of butterflies.
And I, hesitate to even imagine if I could think of, 3 or 4 that I would recognize. How long have you been at this, and how long did it take you to be able to identify this many of them?
Well, I've been doing this for about 25 years, and I still stumble and fumble around when I'm trying to figure out what butterflies I'm catching and so forth. Some of them are very similar, and you literally have to get into a bunch of books and so forth and study their wing patterns and their flight time and the plants that they're eating off of or laying their eggs on. It's a pretty involved thing. It's not very simple. But one of the butterflies that folks see in our region in the spring and long about June in the Tri-Cities is the western tiger swallowtail. It's a big yellow butterfly, and most people say, "Oh yeah, monarch." Well, monarchs are orange and they're yellow, so they're not monarchs, but that's one that most people see. And then when you go hiking in the mountains, you see all these little blue butterflies. Well, there's a whole bunch of different kinds, so you aren't looking at just one same blue butterfly. You get lupin butterflies, and you get butterflies that like so they're all over the place. And there's a lot of them out there. People, once they start looking at butterflies, they start seeing more and more butterflies. And before that, they probably think, well, there's no butterflies. There are lots of them.
And you were talking about the fact that we see butterflies in different parts of their cycle, and oftentimes we don't see them at all. Let's talk a little bit about the life cycle of the butterfly and take us through it from beginning to end.
Sure, the life cycle of a butterfly usually starts, well, we're going to start with the adult stage. That's when the males and the females get together and mate, and then they lay eggs on some specific plant usually, like the monarch butterfly lays its eggs only on milkweed. So they lay their eggs, and those eggs, if they're laid late in the summer, may stay in the grass or on the bushes or somewhere as an egg or even as a little caterpillar all through the winter. And then early in the spring or thereabouts, or maybe a little later, they become a chrysalis. And at that chrysalis stage, the butterfly caterpillar, oh, I forgot to tell you, you go through 5 stages of caterpillar. The little butterfly, or the little caterpillar, chomps away on a leaf, and he gets really fat, and then he bursts his skin, and then he crawls away as a different, slightly different color, and then he eats some more leaves, and he pops again, and then he crawls off. He does this 5 times until he finally gets to the stage where he just can't eat anymore, and he becomes a chrysalis. Now, at the chrysalis stage, the butterfly totally morphs from a caterpillar into a butterfly. And then he crawls out of this cocoon, and he stretches out his wings, and he dries them out, and he comes fluttering around. We see, and he's actually, he or she, off chasing another mate to lay some more eggs. So there you go, the cycle, from egg to caterpillar to chrysalis to butterfly again. And that takes about a year for most butterflies.
Now, what about the environmental impacts on butterflies in our region?
Yes, well, that's a big issue and a big problem. Let me say that just because it's not anything new, the first thing, remember reading or hearing about the Missoula floods? Well, I can imagine when those floods came through the mid-Columbia region, they wiped out all the butterflies and butterfly habitat right down to the basalt in most cases, or washed them up around the Mammoth Dig where I work on other days. At any rate, and so they cleaned this place out. But also, simultaneously, and during that period, there were forest fires in the mountains. The lightning strike or whatever, or maybe the Indians decided to burn off an area because they wanted better grass for their horses. So at any rate, those kind of things have been going on forever. But in the old days, there was lots more space around the fire or around the Missoula flood, so the butterflies could encroach back into the area as new plants and new flowers that arrived. But then at one point, the Europeans arrived with the plow. And of course, they went into our shrub steppe here in the mid-Columbia, and they plowed up all of it virtually and planted wheat and planted orchards and well, now they're planting grape vineyards up the sides of the mountains because that's where they like the vineyards the most, where the cold air in the wintertime slides off under the grapevines. At any rate, so the farmers have had a big effect on our butterfly population. They literally wipe out huge amounts. The sagebrush white, a Puncha beckeri, used to be all over this mid-Columbia region. Now I find them on the Ale property, Airland Ecology Preserve. I find them on the Yakima Fire and Training Center. And if they would let me on it, I'll bet you I'd find them on the Umatilla Army Depot, which I'm hoping will not become more potato farms. But, the economics wins most of the time, okay? So what we're left in our communities, as in the cities, first off, the farmers do one more thing. They spray for insecticides and herbicides and things like that because the public, you and I, demand a perfect apple, a perfect pear. Well, the only way you're going to get that is by spraying insecticides, and when you do that, you kill off everything. And I mean all the insects, dragonflies, butterflies, any of the rest of them. I've been in areas in eastern Washington, like near Sunnyside, North Pasco, northeast of Walla Walla and upper Whitman County, where there are no insects. Well, that means there's no birds too. Remember, they eat them. So at any rate, that's a big problem for us. Another area is the forest fires that we've been having this summer up in the Okanagan and so forth. That takes out a lot of butterfly territory too. Hopefully there's enough butterflies around the edges of these places that they'll come back in again. But how long will that take? We don't know. We haven't been around long enough to see how long it took to recover from, say, the Missoula floods. At any rate, so those are big problems for us. And another problem is the cattle grazing. It was sheep in the past, like John Muir said he wanted to get the sheep out of the Sierra Nevada mountains because they were just eating up everything. Well, the cows do the same thing here. Now, I used to be a farmer, and I understand the necessity for this. They can't grow enough alfalfa on their little patch of ground, and so they have to graze their cows in the mountains. Well, guess what? Maybe they just have to set aside a square mile here and a square mile there that never gets grazed. And that way the butterflies can go from there and spread out where the cows have grazed too much.
What about global warming in this conversation?
Okay, global warming is not so easily defined in butterflies, but I'll give you a couple examples. One thing that happens is that as we had this summer, lots of heat, so the plants and the flowers dry out sooner, so the butterflies don't have as much food to eat. The other thing is the plants are beginning to bloom earlier in the spring, and it may be totally out of sync with the butterfly's life cycle. And so when the butterfly comes out, the plant that it's used to nectaring on or laying its eggs on just isn't there. And so what happens though is the plants slowly try to encroach up the mountainsides and to find a cooler climate that fits them. Well, eventually they go up so high with global warming that there's no higher to go. There's no mountain. So then the plants die out, and then the butterfly dies out. That's a big problem for us. And now, people say, well, I don't believe in global warming. Well, as a butterfly collector, I'll tell you that I've been following a little butterfly called Atelopetes campestris, and it's a Sachem skipper. And it came out of Northern California around San Francisco and has moved up through the Willamette Valley and then up the Columbia River through the Columbia Gorge, up through the Tri-Cities, in my yard actually, and they're moving further north. They're all the way probably up into Canada now, British Columbia. And that's all a result of global warming. An interesting factor is that they're now overwintering in my yard, which used to be too cold for that to happen. So that's an indication. One tiny indication of global warming is a reality.
Hey Jim, if we're collecting butterflies, and we just have such a short time left here to talk about it, but if we're a collector, are there some that we should avoid collecting?
Well, first off, the monarch. We're down to like 3% of the monarchs that were around in 1990. So I would suggest we don't collect the monarchs. They're having enough trouble with that. Next to that monarch is the viceroy butterfly, which looks like the monarch and actually copies the monarch because the monarch's poison and the viceroy is not. So if the monarchs are gone, the birds are going to eat the viceroy, so they're in trouble. It's also known as a butterfly of concern in the state of Washington. So that's important that we don't do it. There are two other butterflies, Mardon and Yuma skippers, and you probably will never see them, but you absolutely don't want to collect those. Those are on the endangered species list. There are so few of them. One of them's down around Mount Adams, and the other one's up in the Dry Falls area. So yes, yeah. Now something else, you ought to understand that collecting butterflies in your backyard is no big deal, okay? But if you collect scientifically like I do, it requires a state license because butterflies, like deer and trout, are considered wildlife in the state of Washington, not so in Oregon. And so you're going to spend $117 or thereabouts a year on a license, and you're also going to have to write copious piles of paper defining all the butterflies you saw, caught, blah, blah, blah.
Right, right.
And I suggest that instead of netting them, use a camera. You collect all you want that way.
Hey, thanks a lot, Jim. So much to talk about. I wish we had more time to do it, but thanks for joining us today, and thank you at home for helping us out. Certainly hope you enjoyed the show today. By all means, if you can stay connected with us all week, you can tweet us, you can like us on Facebook, add us to your circle on Google+, or email us at kwsutv@wsu.edu and send us your show ideas. If you missed any part of today's show, don't worry. It'll all be available online at nwptv.org. I'm Greg Mills. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on air and online.